So we've previously taken a look at this great upheaval which has occurred within Russian society. We've gone from the autocracy of a czar to the consolidated leadership of a small group of people known as Bolsheviks, and they comprise the leadership of the Communist Party. So our goal here is to look at how the leadership of that party reverts back to the rule of one. Now, this isn't exactly a triumvirate like we saw with Rome, because Lenin, the man in the middle, is on top, and his subordinates, Stalin and Trotsky, are below him. But Lenin is the symbol, and he's the voice. Now, Lenin is an intellectual who had training as a lawyer. Stalin was the son of a Georgian cobbler. So he, more than the others, comes from peasant roots. But he understood how to make connections during his rise to the top. Now, his position as Secretary General meant that he was responsible for inducting new members into the Communist Party. So he was able to fill positions based on loyalty to him. Now, Lenin did eventually come to distrust Stalin and thought he was too rude to continue in his post. He wanted to replace him, but by the time he wised up to Stalin's game, it was too little too late. And Leon Trotsky was from a fairly successful Jewish farming family, but he was also a lawyer, and he held the role of prime minister, which meant that he runs the day-to-day operations of the government, and he was very capable and effective at what he did. So these are the big three during the early, kind of the mid-portion of the 20s. Now, the Communist Party will institute the new economic policy from 1921 to 1924. This allowed peasants to keep the land they had recently gained, and many restrictions on private businesses were lifted, and concessions were even made to keep the peasants happy. It was during this time when Soviet labor camps were established with the motto, "With an iron hand, mankind will be driven to happiness." All right, unfortunately, Lenin died in 1924, and Stalin had exploited divisions within the Central Committee to make himself the safe choice for leadership. Not too extreme, just very safe. And just 2 years later, Trotsky was kicked out. All right, he was exiled. Now, Stalin believed in the idea of, well, frankly, he believed in the concept of starting the revolution in one country and focusing there. Trotsky was of a different opinion. All right, and Stalin's vision is obviously going to win out, as we'll see in a little bit. But again, it's certainly worth noting that Joseph Stalin knew how to gain power and consolidate power. He gained power, he consolidated power. If you are going to rule as a dictator, it's often a long journey. You don't just become dictator and you hang on to your position. It's a slow rise to the top. And this concept of socialism in one country means that the Soviet Union will set the example for other Western nations to follow with regard to spreading new ideas. Stalin is all about looking inward and only focusing on the Soviet Union. Now, economically, he launches the first 5-year plan in 1928 with the goal of nationalizing the economy quickly through industrialization. He had cut ties with all foreign economies, so the Soviet people are really going to bear the brunt of his economic policies. Wages are low, and working conditions are harsh, but the results were undeniable. Production of iron, steel, coal, and tractors are going to increase dramatically. And he also institutes what's called collectivization. It's not just industry that's nationalized, it's agriculture. All farms are nationalized and private ownership of land is gone. Peasants were often marched at gunpoint. They're marched at gunpoint to work in these new collectives. And overall, for the national economy, this was so successful that they mostly avoided the Great Depression that plagued capitalist countries. So in Western nations that are really taking it on the chin economically, this will be seen maybe as a viable option. Now, to silence his opposition, Stalin instituted what became known as the Great Purges. He ordered his secret police to arrest former colleagues of Lenin and force them to confess to crimes that didn't really exist before they were shot. And half the Army's officer corps were executed in 1937 alone. And this really was an illogical decision because it was very clear that another war with Germany was going to be on the horizon. Now, the citizens lived in fear that they'd be sent to one of the gulags. So this is how Stalin controlled the Soviet populace. Now, he takes the reins, and he does lead the Soviet Union through World War II. Now, at the start of the war, he had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler of Germany, even though Hitler didn't care for Slavic peoples and Stalin didn't really trust Hitler. Hitler broke the pact in June 1941 when he invaded the Soviet Union. And German forces actually laid siege to Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg. He laid siege to Leningrad for 3 years. 1 million died due to famine, but the Russians fought back. Stalin used his powers of propaganda to emphasize the heroic stands of Russians against previous invasions, like those of Napoleon and those of World War II. And he called the current conflict the Great Patriotic Homeland War. In fact, the Battle of Stalingrad is even considered to be the turning point of World War II. The Germans couldn't penetrate into Moscow, so they swung south to try and seize the oil fields of the Soviet Union. The Soviets ended up surrounding the German forces and annihilating them. Now, the Germans were driven out of Soviet lands by the spring of 1944, and the Red Army was the first to reach Berlin in spring of 1945. Now, the Soviets were merciless towards the German populace as they completed their march, but it still remains that not only did Stalin lead them to victory, he is the individual that his army reached Berlin first. So the Russians would be in a position to somewhat dictate terms. Near the end of World War II, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at the Yalta Conference, which is on the Black Sea. Now, Stalin was terrified of flying and he preferred trains, so he actually set the meeting at a place closer to home so he could gain leverage on his Western allies. They all agreed to the formation of the United Nations, but pretty much everyone knew Stalin was going to leave his Red Army in Eastern Europe following the end of the war. Stalin and other Soviets feared another invasion through the West, and they wanted a buffer zone of protection. And you can't necessarily blame the Soviets for thinking another Western invasion would come, because they were invaded by Napoleon, and then invaded by Germany twice, so they just didn't want it to happen again. At the Potsdam Conference that same summer, Stalin declared that everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. And this really signifies the beginning of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, there were strong communist parties in place in Eastern Europe that had fought other fascists. But Stalin wanted a top-down command, so local leaders are replaced with men loyal to Moscow. Little by little, one by one, the societies of Eastern Europe began to fear that their neighbors might be listening in on their conversations and turn them in. So the Iron Curtain had truly arisen.